bargaining over issues, resolving conflict within employment relations is a difficult and complex business. We've talked about the role of agency in representing and providing a mechanism by which conflict is expressed. And bargaining and the use of bargaining agents is one of those key representations of agency which allows for conflict to be resolved effectively. But the role of agency can result in some particular issues of their own, that where we see this relationship between principals on the one hand, so in employment relations, employees and employers, and agents on the other, say union and management, there's the opportunity for a gap to emerge, for a gap between the principal and their interests and the agent and their own interests, where what principals expect and what agents deliver are not always going to be the same, that the gaps occur. And this can also become a particular issue because the agents, the bargainers, can begin to develop a relationship of their own. They're not robots. They don't just sit and express the interests of the people that they represent. They have to engage with each other. So a relationship develops. We want this relationship to develop. We need a certain degree of trust. We need flexibility. We need negotiators to be able to make deals with each other. But this can create a problem in terms of how then do bargainers effectively sell the deals that they make? How do they sell the agreements that they make between agents back to their principals? And so this problem of bargaining, which Walton and McKersey identify as intra-organisational bargaining issues, also need to be considered. What are the mechanisms? What are the approaches? What are the tactics that bargainers might make use of to help to resolve these intra-organisational bargaining issues? So it's an issue of agency, about the separation between bargainers and principals. Now, two types of conflict can emerge, by and large, in these kinds of situations. The first of those kinds of conflict is boundary conflict. And boundary conflict emerges where there are conflicting expectations between what your own side expect of you as their agent and what your bargaining partner, your bargaining opponent, expects of you as a fellow bargainer. And the mechanisms of behaviour, the modes of behaviour, the things that you try to achieve and the ways in which you try to achieve them become kind of disconnected, and there's a sense of gap between what you are doing and what is expected of you from these two very different audiences. So boundary conflict on the one hand. The second kind of conflict that we can observe in these kinds of situations is factional conflict. And factional conflict emerges over bargaining objectives, about just how ambitious we should be, for example, about what exactly we should be seeking to achieve, and that you, as a bargainer, may have views about what is attainable or what is realistic or what is desirable, which is different from some others within your own group, within your own principles. And that becomes an issue in itself. The other form of factional conflict is not just over what it is that you're attempting to achieve, but the mechanisms, the means by which you attempt to achieve them. So the bargaining strategy that you may be pursuing, or the tactics that you use, and then there's scope for, a huge degree of differences of opinion about what the right approach should be in any bargaining situation, which ultimately only the bargainer can resolve. But that doesn't mean that you don't have to deal with those differences of opinion about people who know better, about people who would have done it differently, who then may make life difficult for you when you're attempting to relate back what the deal is actually going to be. And you'll be subject to all kinds of criticism about you should have done X or Y or Z or A or B or C. And there are always other things that you could have done if only the other person had been in the room. So resolving these internal conflicts, whether they're boundary conflicts or whether they're factional conflicts, means that the bargainer is attempting to close the gap between principals' expectations and the achievement of the bargaining outcome. So those expectations, they might either be substantive, so what was actually achieved in the bargain, what was the result of the pay claim, did you get what you wanted, was the increase enough, was the change in working conditions enough, what were the trade-offs that were concluded, was the cost too high for the benefit, all of those are substantive elements, things that are about what the deal actually was. The other kind of expectations that we see that might need to be dealt with are more on the behavioural side, that the bargainer behaved in ways that were expected or anticipated or required. Now, as I say, bargainers on the management side against the union side, they have their own relationship. And so the ways of behaving between bargainers may become relatively close, warm, trusting, but it may be that the principals would actually like to see less of that. They want to see more evidence of robust defence of interests, which doesn't really seem to fit with a warm and trusting relationship, even though that might actually be the best way of achieving the kind of outcomes that you want. So the behavioural expectations of principals is an important thing to resolve on the part of the bargainer. Now, whether the expectations that we're talking about are substantive or behavioural, bargainers have to deal with the potential gap between expectation and achievement in various ways. And there are three broad approaches that a bargainer might take towards any of these gaps of substantive or behavioural expectations. The first thing that a bargainer might do would be to conform to expectations. They might ignore those expectations without challenging them, just kind of pretend that they're not there. Or they might actively attempt to modify those expectations. Now, given that we've got two broad types of expectations, substantive and behavioural, and we've got three potential approaches towards dealing with any one of those, that gives us a range of potential strategies that we might employ in terms of dealing with these intra-organisational conflicts. So, on the one hand, if we're dealing with behavioural expectations, our choices are to try and modify, ignore, or conform. Similarly, with the bargainer's choices regarding the substantive expectations of their own side. We can attempt to modify, ignore, or conform. So there are 9 potential strategies that we might employ. Some of those strategies, though, are simply untenable. So if we want to behave in a radically different way than our principals expect us to, then we are unlikely, extremely unlikely, to be able to modify our principals' expectations in a relatively short time frame. So that would simply be untenable. We can't modify behavioural expectations. It's not feasible to do so in the short run. We can't simply conform to a whole range of substantive expectations and at the same time, come out with a compromise deal. Because conforming to substantive expectations means that we are not able to compromise to any great degree. So we might solve our intra-organisational problem, but our inter-organisational problem between, say, the workforce and the organisation that we're bargaining with will not be resolved. We won't strike a bargain. So when we look at the range of possibilities for dealing with these intra-organisational concerns, we're effectively left with three broad options. The first option is to attempt to modify your own side's aspirations. So this is dealing with substantive concerns. And here we're attempting to moderate expectations. So we don't have people's expectations of what the bargaining outcome is going to be raised too high, so that then when we achieve substantially less than that, that people are naturally going to feel upset. So we attempt to modify the aspirations of our own side by directly confronting the aspirations of the people that we represent and change them, either by raising arguments about the utility or the usefulness of the issues around which we might seek to bargain, the feasibility of achieving them. It's all right. We would all like to earn £1 million, but it simply isn't going to happen. And so we have to be more realistic, reining in those expectations, or maybe discussing or highlighting the potential costs of achieving a particular outcome, that we would have to suffer too much in order to gain the outcome that is expected. So on the one hand, we might modify our side's aspirations, and we may seek to ignore at least some of the behavioural expectations. Challenging behavioural expectations, as we've seen, is unfeasible in the short term, but we might ignore quietly the expectations. So our behaviour might cause some concern on our side, but we can possibly ride out that concern in order to secure the deal that we think is in the best interests of the people that we represent. Now, this approach, this strategy towards intra-organisational conflict obviously makes sense in some situations rather than others. We would clearly need to be fairly confident of convincing our principals that this was indeed the best substantive outcome on offer. So we'd have to be fairly clear and confident in our own reading of the situation, and confident that we can convince the principals that there wasn't a better deal available if we'd done something else, or pursued a different strategy, or been more robust, or been prepared to take more of a hit in order to get what we wanted. We also need to be fairly confident in our relationship with our principals, so that we can get away with some of the behaviour that might be considered a little bit deviant, a little bit outside of the expectations. A second option for resolving intra-organisational conflict would be to attempt to modify our side's expectations. So similar to the last issue, we may need to moderate expectations. And in this case, to entirely conform to behavioural expectations. So we're trying to be much more active in resolving the gap between expectations and achievement in terms of how we behave. We're doing all of the things that we're expected to do as a negotiator. We are behaving in ways that are entirely expected of us. Now, the resolution of the intra-organisational conflict in this situation is achieved by effectively letting the need for change develop naturally from the situation itself. That the outcome of this negotiation was always going to be this way, that there's a sense of inevitability about it. It's nothing to do with the fact that I behaved strangely as a negotiator. There was a need to moderate your expectations and that the bargainer needs to be fairly upfront about that. But no question can be raised about how effectively the negotiator behaved. They did all of the things that were expected of them. It was simply that the situation was always going to result in an outcome like this. The final strategy that a bargainer might employ is, rather than to actively attempt to modify the substantive expectations of principals, to let those expectations just ride along, to effectively ignore the expectations of your principals, even when you know as a bargainer that you're extremely unlikely to be able to achieve them. Whilst you're doing that, you're behaving in a way which is entirely in line with the way in which you're expected to behave. You see, from each of these three strategies, that behavioral compliance is a very important part of resolving these conflicts. And if you're seen to behave in the right way, then you get a lot more leeway in terms of resolving the substantive expectations. So in this final option, we're ignoring the substantive aspirations but behaving appropriately. The bargainer is doing very little about the fact that the aspirations of principals are heading in this direction, and what he's able to achieve is heading in a different direction. You don't attempt to resolve that along the way. You're not trying to modify them, but you make the best agreement that you think you can based on your own judgment, and that you hope that when you take this back to your principals, it is accepted as a fait accompli. It is a done deal. It's take it or leave it. Now, of course, this approach raises much higher risks of discontent, which makes the demonstration of behavioral acceptability much more important. You're behaving acceptably, so we will, maybe accept your judgment to a greater degree. You certainly can't get away with ignoring aspirations and behaving strangely at the same time. So there's huge risks of discontent, and it may simply be that the negotiator has to make the judgment that they can simply ride out that discontent over the medium term.